Pursuits of Wisdom _ 6 Ways of Life in John M. Cooper. John M. Cooper's Pursuits of Wisdom recovers ancient pagan philosophy as competing ways of life, complete, reason-grounded guides to living, from Socrates through Plotinus. Against Hadot's spiritual exercises model, Cooper insists on rigorous argumentation. Against modern academic specialization, he restores the steersman of life. This examination follows his chapter structure in Analytic Register. Argumentative prose first, crystallized distinctions where they earn a label. Abstract. John M. Cooper's Pursuits of Wisdom. 6 Ways of Life in Ancient Philosophy from Socrates to Plotinus, Princeton, 2012, argues that ancient pagan philosophy, from its Socratic origins through 1,000 years of Greek and Roman practice, was widely pursued as a way of life, a complete guide to living grounded in rigorous, reasoned argument, not merely an academic specialty. Cooper distinguishes living from one's philosophy, the ancient steersman model, in which reasoned understanding directly motivates and structures action, from living in accordance with it, the modern model of following external precepts. He posits 3 Socratic assumptions that made the ancient project possible and that modernity has largely abandoned. Reason as inherent motivator, philosophy as reason's perfection, and knowledge of the good as psychologically decisive. The book's 6 chapters examine successive answers to the Socratic question. Socrates makes continuous philosophical inquiry the best human life, identifying virtue with wisdom while distinguishing unattainable divine wisdom, sigma omicron phi alpha, from temporary human knowledge, pi iota sigma tau mu eta. Aristotle bifurcates the ideal into 2 hierarchically ranked lives: contemplative, theoretical, sigma omicron phi alpha, and political, practical phi nu eta sigma iota, with ethical virtues, grounded in practical versus theoretical knowledge. Stoicism reunifies all virtue as single rational wisdom, deducing ethics from cosmic theology and rejecting passions as errors of judgment. Epicureanism and skepticism offer empiricist alternatives subordinating or suspending reason's dogmatic claims. Plotinus spiritualizes the project. The true self is intellect. Happiness is contemplation. Philosophy is both means and essence of ascent. Before the epilogue traces the tradition's demise through Iamblichus's theurgy and Augustine's turn to Christianity. Executive summary. Central thesis. Ancient philosophy from Socrates to Plotinus is best understood as a set of competing ways of life, each a complete, reason-grounded guide to living, not a museum of doctrines or a regimen of spiritual exercises. One was to live from one's philosophy, the steersman implanted in mind and character, not merely in accordance with external precepts. 3 Socratic assumptions made that project possible. Reason motivates. Philosophy perfects reason. Knowledge of the good is psychologically decisive. Modernity has largely abandoned the third. Hence, academic philosophy today cannot function as a whole way of life in the ancient sense. Cooper's forensic question is whether those assumptions can still persuade, and whether the 6 ancient answers remain resources for anyone who comes to philosophy hoping it will alter life for the better. Foundational observations. Living from / in accordance with, steersman model versus external rule following. Cooper's mastercut against both modern ethics and Hadot. 3 Socratic assumptions. Reason motivates. Philosophy perfects reason. Knowledge of the good is psychologically decisive. Hadot critique. Spiritual exercises are late antique contamination from religion. The Socratic core is rigorous argumentation. Virtue as wisdom. Socrates' unity of virtue. Sigma omicron phi alpha unattainable, pi iota sigma tau mu eta temporary. Best life equals continuous phi iota lambda omicron sigma omicron phi alpha. 2 happy lives. Aristotle contemplative versus political. Practical versus theoretical knowledge. Ethics incomplete without politics. Stoic reunification. Living in agreement with logos. Virtue sole good. Preferred indifference. Apatheia versus metriopathia. Empiricist alternatives. Epicurean catastematic pleasure and instrumental virtue. skeptic epiche, and fourfold observances. Plotinian ascent, true self as intellect, three-level virtue, philosophy as means and essence of happiness. Demise, Iamblichus's theurgy and Augustine's Christianity dissolve trust that reason alone can steer a life. Significance and recommendation. Essential for anyone who wants ancient ethics as lived philosophy rather than as raw material for modern theory. Read Cooper against Haddon. Keep the spiritual seriousness, restore the arguments. Dwell on ch1 for the steersman distinction, ch3 to 4 for the Aristotle/Stoa hinge, ch6 epilogue for why the project ended. Pair with primary texts, Apology, X, Epictetus, Sextus, Enneads, and with Montaigne or Pascal for later receptions of living from philosophy. On philosophy as a way of life, Cooper opens by naming the tension that haunts every philosophy department. In the popular imagination, a philosopher is still someone wise about how to live, yet professional philosophy is overwhelmingly a theoretical specialty like physics or anthropology. His project is to recover what was lost, the ancient conviction, beginning with Socrates, that philosophy is not merely a subject of study, but the steersman of a life, the intellectual basis and motivating force for the best human existence. This chapter defines that thesis, distinguishes it sharply from Pierre Hadot's spiritual exercises model, and lays out the three Socratic assumptions that made the ancient project possible and that modernity has largely abandoned. Philosophy: ancient, modern, and contemporary. Philosophy is a subject of study in contemporary universities, departments, degrees, professionals who write articles on philosophy as physicists write on physics. Yet even as a specialty, it differs from all others. In the popular imagination, a philosopher is a wise person with deep insight into what to value, how to face adversity, how to sustain a balanced human outlook. People speak of a philosophy of life with no thought of academic validation. Treating one's personal commitment as subject to disciplinary scrutiny might even seem to degrade it. Still, Cooper argues, these popular ideas reflect something deeply ingrained in philosophy from its Greek origins. For more than a millennium, philosophy was assiduously studied as the best way to become good and live well. The enduring presence of ethics as one of philosophy's principal branches marks the difference between philosophy and every other university major. Moral philosophy deals with how one ought to live. Since everyone has a life to live, the subject professes to concern everyone essentially, not incidentally. Modern ethics has shifted focus from goodness and badness of character, the ancient starting point, to rightness and wrongness of action. Utilitarianism, Kantianism, intuitionism, divine command, natural law. Contemporary normative theory asks which actions in given circumstances are right or wrong, and what ultimate basis justifies the classification. Ancient moral philosophy starts from the good condition of the soul. Rightness and wrongness of action enter only as expressions of that character. Only in antiquity, Cooper insists, did philosophy realize to the fullest extent all that moral philosophy's combination of theory and practice might involve. One was to live one's life from, not merely in accordance with, one's philosophy. Philosophy did not just guide life from outside. It steered life directly from its implanted position in mind and character. Three assumptions made this possible. Human reason is an inherent power of motivation. Philosophy develops and perfects that capacity, and knowledge of the good is psychologically decisive. The power of truth from Plato's Protagoras, whereby if someone knows what is good and bad, he will not be forced to act otherwise than knowledge dictates. Modern philosophy largely rejects the third. Hence, even moral philosophy today cannot function as a whole way of life. Against Haddon, Cooper also refuses to treat spiritual exercises as belonging to philosophy from Parmenides onward. Those practices are a late contamination from religion that omit the central place of rigorous argumentation. Living from / in accordance with steersman model, reasoned understanding structures and motivates action from within, versus external precept following. Three Socratic assumptions. Reason motivates. Philosophy perfects reason. Knowledge of the good is psychologically decisive. Character before action. Ancient ethics starts from Roep Solentau as good condition of the soul. Modern ethics often starts from right/wrong act classifications. Quote, one was to live one's life from, not just as one could put it, in accordance with one's philosophy. Your philosophy did not just guide your life, it steered your life directly from its implanted position in your mind and character. What it means to live a philosophy. The essential core of philosophy, for ancients and moderns alike, is a specifically philosophical style of logical, reasoned argument, whether in Plato's Socratic dialogues, Hegel's system, or contemporary analytic prose. A philosophical way of life is fundamentally different from a religious one. To live philosophically is to live from argued through, rationally grasped, rationally defended ideas about the world and one's place in it, precisely on the basis of that reasoned understanding. One cannot accept what a sacred text recommends just because it is sacred. One must understand everything for oneself. A mere feeling of conviction induced through prayer or personal relationship with a higher power will not do. The only existential option in ancient philosophy, Cooper argues against had it, is the basic commitment to being a philosopher, to living on the basis of philosophical reason. Choosing Epicureanism or Stoicism is not existential, but rational. It depends on arguments in favor of a school's fundamental principles. Many ancients studied at more than one Athenian school before settling. First came the decision to live according to reason. This commitment set philosophers off as a single group from the rest of the population across more than 1,000 years of pagan Greek and Roman practice. Only in late antiquity, long after classical and Hellenistic heyday, did philosophy begin to share features of religious life. Had its spiritual exercises belong to that period of mutual contamination between pagan philosophy and Christianity, not to Socrates or Plato. Cooper closes with an invitation rather than a nostalgia piece. Someone who comes to academic philosophy hoping it will alter life directly for the better has no viable alternative except to study ancient philosophies in the spirit they were written, with a view to self-improvement. The governing assumptions may still be true, or plausible enough to encourage weighing the varied theories the ancients constructed for the constitution of one's own life. The book that follows is philosophy written to expand the contemporary philosophical imagination by understanding ancient philosophy as it actually was. Reason as non-negotiable core. Devotion to rigorous logical thought. School allegiance follows argument, not a pre-rational leap. Philosophy versus religion. No sacred authority without one's own understanding. Late antique spiritual exercises are contamination, not the Socratic founding project. Quote, knowledge is a fine thing, capable of ruling a person, and if someone were to know what is good and bad, then he would not be forced by anything to act otherwise than knowledge dictates. The Socratic way of life. If philosophy as a way of life has an originator, Cooper locates him in the notional Socrates of Plato's Apology and Socratic dialogues, not the barely recoverable historical figure, but the paradigmatic philosopher who made care of the soul the supreme human concern and made continuous philosophical discussion the form of the best life. This chapter argues that pre-Socratics and even Pythagoreans fail the test, explicates Socrates' divine mission and his definitions of virtue, and resolves the paradox of Socratic ignorance through the distinction between wisdom, sigma omicron phi alpha, and knowledge, pi iota sigma tau mu eta. Ancient philosophy as intellectual pursuit versus as way of life. Not everyone in antiquity whom we classify as philosophers conceived of their work as aimed at providing a way of life. Many seem motivated by what motivates most philosophers nowadays. They found philosophical thinking engrossing, enjoyed logical analysis, and were fascinated by questions without proposing to live from a theory of the human good. Cooper surveys the pre-Socratics under a clear criterion. Does the philosophy include a theory of what is good for a human being? And does it propose that one live from the reasoning that leads to and supports that theory? By that standard, the early natural philosophers fail. They neglected questions about human good, so their systems could not function as ways of life even for themselves. Democritus had a broad theory of human values, but did not put forward the idea of living on the basis of the philosophical reasoning that supports those conclusions. Heraclitus's obscurity prevents judgment. Pythagoras and Pythagorean brotherhoods combined philosophical ideas with dogmas, rituals, and dietary taboos in ways that may have suggested a model to Socrates, yet remains doubtful that the philosophical ideas in this mix functioned as philosophy does in Socratic and later conceptions, mutually determining a whole life through reasoned argument rather than inherited cult. Only the notional Socrates meets both conditions fully. He is the foundation for the entire subsequent pagan tradition Cooper will track. Cooper's criterion, theory of the human good, and the claim that one should live from the reasoning that supports it. Pre-Socratic gap, natural philosophy without life-steering ethics. Pythagorean mix too cultic to count as the Socratic paradigm. Quote, among the philosophers whom we conventionally cast as pre-Socratics, the only predecessor of Socrates whom one could reasonably suggest as a philosopher who conceived his philosophy as a way of life is Pythagoras. Nonetheless, seems doubtful that the philosophical ideas in this mix functioned in a way comparable to the role of philosophy in Socratic and later conceptions. Socrates in Plato's Apology. Given the literary conventions of philosophical drama, Cooper works with a notional Socrates, the historical person as refracted especially through Plato, rather than a fragile historical reconstruction. Plato's Apology presents that figure as devoted over many years to full-time philosophical discussion in Athens' public places, with young men and established citizens alike. Discussions always concerned human life, what courage, modesty, friendship, or virtue is, whether oratorical skill is good. Socrates required interlocutors to take themselves seriously as truth-seekers, to explain and defend opinions by reasons, and to accept logical consequences. The Apology offers samples. Socrates cross-examines Meletus on the impiety and corruption charges, reducing him to self-contradiction and implausible assertions, the two failures that mark inadequate moral views throughout Socratic inquiry. Socrates' central claim is that one's soul and its condition, good or bad, is the most important thing for anyone. What he has spent his life trying to convince Athenians of. From the Protagoras, no one goes willingly toward the bad. True knowledge of the good is psychologically irresistible. Philosophy as continuous examination is therefore the practical expression of caring for the soul above wealth, health, honor, or life itself. The mission is not a hobby or professional specialty, but an all-consuming divine calling whose method is logical relation, implication, inconsistency, applied to values. Soul over all else. The soul's condition outweighs every conventional good. Protagoras' principle. No one willingly chooses the bad. Knowledge of the good, when achieved, suffices for right action. Quote, later on in Plato's Apology, Socrates famously maintains that one's soul and its condition, whether good or bad, is the most important thing for anyone. That, he says, is what he has gone about the city of Athens all his life, trying to convince his fellow citizens of, both old and young. Socratic philosophy as a way of life. Between the Apology and this section, Cooper develops Socrates' definitions of virtue. Virtue is wisdom, a complete, firm, systematic understanding of all human values. All virtues are one. Justice, courage, temperance, and piety are the same knowledge applied to different contexts. Courage is knowledge of goods under threat. Temperance is knowledge applied to bodily pleasures. Piety is knowledge of respect for divine and country. Wisdom, sigma omicron phi alpha, is permanent, complete, divine, unattainable for humans. Knowledge, iota sigma tau mu eta, is temporary human grasp of specific moral truths from complete understanding of a domain. Socrates lacks wisdom but can possess knowledge at times. That distinction resolves the paradox of claimed ignorance alongside confident moral assertions. At trial, Socrates knows it would be disgraceful to abandon his way of life for an unknown death. He would trade a known great good, philosophical examination, to avoid something not known to be bad. The best possible human life is therefore the continuous pursuit, phi iota lambda omicron sigma omicron phi alpha, love of wisdom, of the unattainable divine wisdom. Virtue as good condition of the soul consists in perfection of the ability to understand and argue about values, made absolutely secure and permanent in wisdom, but approximated through lifelong philosophical activity. Even acting fully well at some times is rare. Wisdom belongs to God alone. Philosophy is the human approximation. Virtue as wisdom/unity of virtue, one systematic understanding of values, differently applied. Wisdom versus knowledge, divine permanent grasp, unattainable, versus temporary justified human grasp. Socrates has the latter at times, never the former. Best human life, continuous phi iota lambda omicron sigma omicron phi alpha, as the only way to substantiate care for the soul, given that sigma omicron phi alpha exceeds human reach. Quote, for Socrates, then, knowledge is the grasp of the truth of some fact or group of facts on the basis of a comprehensive, complete understanding of the whole system of facts. Wisdom goes beyond that knowledge by requiring that, once acquired, it be so deeply and firmly settled in one's mind that one would be prepared for all future time, always to do what is right and best. Socrates and the subsequent tradition. Cooper closes the chapter by tracing how later schools inherit and transform the Socratic project. Plato systematizes Socratic inquiry into comprehensive metaphysics and psychology, forms recollection, philosopher kings, as expansion of care for the soul. Aristotle splits practical and theoretical wisdom into two happinesses, the first major bifurcation of Socratic unity. Stoics reunify virtue as a single rational condition and push Socratic intellectualism to systematic extreme, living in agreement with cosmic reason. Epicureans and skeptics ground life in sensation or suspend judgment on reason's dogmatic claims. Alternative ways of life with diminished rationalism. Plotinus spiritualizes the ascent of intellect. Throughout, the question remains, can rigorous philosophical argument function as the steersman of life? Socrates' answer, that the pursuit of wisdom is the best life, sets the terms for every subsequent answer Cooper will examine. Inheritance map. Plato expands, Aristotle bifurcates, Stoics reunify, empiricists diminish reason's dogmatic claim, Plotinus spiritualizes. Quote, no one goes willingly toward the bad, or what he believes to be bad. Neither is it in human nature to want to go toward what one believes to be bad, instead of to the good. Aristotle, philosophy as two ways of life. Aristotle inherits the Socratic project and complicates it decisively. Where Socrates lived a single open-ended pursuit of wisdom about the human good, Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics and politics establish philosophy as two hierarchically ranked ways of life. The contemplative life organized under theoretical wisdom, sigma omicron phi alpha, and the practically active political life organized under practical wisdom, phi rho nu eta sigma iota, together with the ethical virtues. Cooper's chapter is a sustained, close reading of that bifurcation, of practical versus theoretical knowledge, of two happinesses, and of the claim that ethics is incomplete without politics. Introduction. For Aristotle, philosophy itself and the life of philosophy are far more complex than they were for Socrates. He wrote and lectured whole treatises advancing positive theses across logic, nature, soul, metaphysics, and divinity. Yet when Cooper turns to philosophy as a way of life, the controlling texts are the Nicomachean Ethics and the Politics. Ethics, for Aristotle, is a powerful and essentially freestanding part of philosophy, separate from theoretical inquiries into nature and God, even while physical and metaphysical results stand as indispensable background for understanding human nature and our place in the world. The ethics presents itself as the first part of a single enterprise whose second and concluding part is the politics. From the outset, in I 1-2, Aristotle describes the concern of ethics as the highest human good. Happiness, something individuals possess as individuals. But he is at pains to make that concern part of political knowledge, the most architectonic science. Full knowledge of the good and happy human life belongs, on this view, exclusively to political knowledge. Ethics is therefore an undertaking in pursuit of, and as part of, that capacity. Commentators often mention this political framing and then set it aside, because Aristotle carries books, X.8, largely without making the political dimension an explicit topic. Only at the end, in X9, does he return. Despite everything already covered, we do not yet know all we need in order to grasp happiness fully. We must turn to constitutions and systems of laws. Two ideas control that closing chapter, and they control Cooper's reading of the whole. First, ethical and political knowledge are essentially practical, not theoretical or contemplative. The knowledge acquired by reading and thinking through the ethics properly will necessarily affect, indeed control, how one leads one's whole life. Second, happiness cannot be fully achieved except in a political community, a shared project of living well as a group. Together, these ideas explain how philosophical analysis itself becomes a crucial component of the well-lived life's most distinctive activities, and why Aristotle can claim that philosophy establishes not one, but two best ways of life for human beings. Ethics, politics, unity. The Nicomachean Ethics is not a self-contained treatise on private happiness followed by separate politics. From I 1-2 onward, knowledge of the highest good is the fundamental part of architectonic political science. Two controlling ideas, X9 practical, not theoretical, character of ethical knowledge, and a claim that the highest good is fully realizable only in a political community. Quote, for Aristotle, understanding the highest human good, just by itself, so to speak, as a good of individual persons, the function of the ethics is in an essential and fundamental way part of acquiring the political capacity or power. This capacity is, as he puts it, the most controlling or most architectonic science or knowledge. Practical versus theoretical knowledge. Aristotle opens X9 by reminding us that where actions to be done, tau, pyro alpha kappa tau, are concerned, our goal is not to develop theories, theta epsilon omega rho sigma alpha iota, and know in a contemplative way, but to come to act ourselves. The same insistence appears already in Book 2. The present undertaking, pyro alpha gamma mu alpha tau epsilon alpha, is not for the sake of developing theories as our other ones are, for we are not inquiring so as to know what virtue is, but so as to become good people, because happiness itself consists in virtuous activity. Seeking to become good is, more fundamentally, seeking the highest good through these studies. The contrast is not merely one of subject matter. Theoretical understanding of mathematics, physics, or metaphysics can be non-committal. One can know planetary motions without being moved to live differently. Practical understanding of human goods, by contrast, is an understanding of what is of value as being of value. It sees and embraces its object as valuable. Someone who could articulate every argument for the value of virtue, yet remain indifferent would not, on Aristotle's view, properly understand that value. To understand something is good for a human being is already to be moved toward it. No separate feeling of attraction need be added for the motivation provided in the understanding itself to be at work. That understanding is phyronueta sigma iota, practical wisdom, an intellectual virtue which, together with fully habituated virtuous states of feeling, makes one simply or without qualification good, pi lambda gamma alpha theta. Aristotle's notorious prerequisite follows from this analysis. No one is to study ethics and politics without first having acquired, through upbringing, good habits of feeling. Those habits give an intuitive attraction to proper behavior and an intuitive dislike of its opposites. Without them, one will not listen or will not understand, when reason explains why. The well-brought-up young adults, Aristotle, admits to his lectures are not yet fully virtuous. They're decent, pi iota epsilon iota kappa, rather than fully good, gamma alpha theta. Philosophy supplies the cultivated, argued, articulate grasp of human values that turns settled decency into full virtue. The copestone that clarifies and supports merely intuitive feelings, and thereby makes one live the happy life. Practical knowledge grasps the human good as valuable and thereby motivates. Unique among branches of knowledge in providing guiding oversight for a whole life. Decent versus fully good. Habituated decency without philosophical understanding is not yet virtue. Practical wisdom completes character by making the grasp of value articulate and decisive. Quote, "The present undertaking, Paro alpha mu alpha epsilon alpha, is not for the sake of developing theories as our other ones are, for we are not inquiring so as to know what virtue is, but so as to become good people, the highest good, happiness, and virtue." Before Cooper can complete the political argument of X9, he must show why Aristotle thinks the happy life is the life of virtue, and how philosophical understanding of ethics can produce the moral improvement Aristotle claims. The contribution is Aristotle's answer to a Socratic urgency. Socrates associated wisdom with justice and the other social virtues without a fully developed psychology to underwrite the association. Later Greek philosophy had to supply the analyses of soul and nature that would support those convictions. Aristotle's unusual view of soul is the starting point. Soul is the essential basis of any living things being alive at all. Plants as well as animals, sponges as well as human beings, and even the eternal divine entities whose thought orders the world. A life just as a living thing's life activities. If any go badly, the life goes badly to that extent. Yet voluntary activities are vastly more significant for the human good, organizing the ethics and politics around that good. Aristotle names it happiness. Epsilon delta alpha iota omicron alpha, if there is some end wished for because of itself, while other things are wished for because of it, that will be the best good, the target that lets us hit what we ought to do. He takes for granted, as the whole subsequent Greek tradition does, that a well-lived life is organized by some overall highest goal. His quest is to identify which end conforms to our nature. Happiness, he insists, must be some human activity. Money, bodily pleasure, and other passively received payoffs are silly candidates for the highest good of essentially active beings. If they are good at all, it is only through relation to more basic activities. The distinctive human difference from other earthly living things is possession of reason, lambda gamma omicron. The highest good must therefore be a rational activity we engage in by employing the power of reason. Following the Republic Socrates, Aristotle recognizes three powers that have reason: appetite and spirit, rational only derivatively by being trained to obey, and reason in the strict sense. The highest good cannot rest in the derivative activities alone. It must be located in non-derivative rational activity, practical thinking about the human good, and theoretical thinking about nature, mathematics, metaphysics, and theology, when those powers are exercised with their proper virtues. In the preliminary sketch of NEI 7, Aristotle leaves the account inclusive and undifferentiated. The human good is rational activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, or, if there are more than one relevant virtues, in accordance with the best and most complete. The point of the sketch is simply that our natural good consists in the exercise, over a mature lifetime, of reason perfected by its excellences, and that from that goal we are to judge the ultimate value of everything else. Against this background, health, money, pleasure, status, and competitive success become secondary goods. If justice and the commonly recognized virtues are among reason's excellences, they are important components of our highest good. Preferring any of those lesser goods above virtuous action is abandoning concern for the true goodness of one's own life. Precisely the error Socrates diagnosed in Athens. Aristotle reaches essentially the same conclusion, but by openly presenting the philosophical argument Socrates never fully articulated. The distinction between mere decency and full virtue is itself a philosophical distinction. Ordinary good upbringing does not even make it intelligible. Happiness as activity. Epsilon delta alpha iota mu omicron nu alpha is not a passive payoff, but the organizing activity of a life. Rational activity of soul in accordance with virtue, or the best and most complete virtue. 3 rational powers, appetite and spirit, derivatively rational when trained to obey. Practical reason, theoretical reason. The I-7 sketch includes all 3 pending the later hierarchy. Quote, from this perspective, we can readily see that and understand why, if anyone ever acts in such a way as to express a preference for or to give a higher ranking to any of those other putative goods I have mentioned, health, money, bodily pleasure, achievement of what one wanted, etc., above virtuous action itself, they are abandoning a concern for the true goodness of their own life, a concern for their own good, in preference for something whose manifestly lesser value to them has been established, again, by careful philosophical reflection. And acting in that misguided way, of course, is precisely what Socrates said so many of his Athenian contemporaries were doing all the time. The remedy for that, Socrates thought, was philosophy. We have now seen how Aristotle draws upon and develops philosophical principles of his own so as to reach essentially the same conclusions in this regard as Socrates had reached, though Socrates reached them, as we saw in Chapter 2, without openly and fully presenting the arguments needed to establish them. 2 happy lives, 2 happinesses, the contemplative and the practically active lives. Having filled out the book I sketched through books 2 to 9, Aristotle returns in X 6 to 8 to give a final, still sketchy account of the human good that takes the filled-in virtues into account. He now distinguishes 2 sorts of virtuous activity. The first is theoretical. Reason thinking about theoretical matters when it possesses the virtues that ensure unerring understanding of the truth. Above all sigma omicron phi alpha, wisdom that includes full understanding of the objects that are highest by nature, the divine and eternal first agents of the world order, culminating in the cosmic God whose thought is the ultimate source of orderly cosmic behavior. The second combines practical knowledge with the activities of appetite and spirit, when those have been habituated to produce exactly the right feelings as practical knowledge dictates. The standard virtues of character, courage, temperance, justice, and the rest, exercised by someone who possesses them fully and understands what they require. Cooper introduces his own clarifying terminology. Practical virtue names the unified condition of practical thought and correctly trained feeling, which books 6:12 to 13 shows cannot exist apart. Corresponding to the 2 activities, Aristotle distinguishes 2 happy lives, contemplative and practically active, each characterized as happy because one or the other activity is present in it as its highest organizing good. Completing the inclusive sketch of I-7, he now ranks them. The life organized under the virtues of theoretical reasoning is happiest. The other is happy only in a secondary way or in the second rank. Strictly speaking, epsilon delta alpha iota mu omicron nu alpha is not a mere sort of activity, virtuous activity, but one specific activity, that of the theoretical intellect's virtues, which alone is complete or final happiness. Tau epsilon lambda epsilon alpha, epsilon delta alpha iota mu omicron nu alpha. The activity of the practical virtues, made the organizing principle of a whole life, is secondary happiness. The first life is the theoretical or contemplative life, already flagged in I-5 among 3 prominent types, alongside the vulgarian's life of pleasure and the political life. The second, Cooper argues, is the political life of I-5, the life of someone devoted to the moral and social virtues as an expert political leader. Why the practically happy life should require political leadership rather than private citizenly virtue is a question Cooper postpones to the politics discussion. What matters first is that Aristotle has split Socrates' single pursuit of wisdom into 2 possessible wisdoms and 2 livable forms of happiness, hierarchically ordered, with contemplation at the peak. Contemplative life, organized under sigma omicron phi alpha and the theoretical virtues, tau epsilon lambda epsilon alpha, epsilon delta alpha iota mu omicron nu alpha, happiest without qualification. Political/practically active life, organized under Phi Eta Sigma Iota and the ethical virtues, happy in the second rank, and for Aristotle, best exemplified by the expert political leader. Quote, he argues explicitly and clearly that the life organized under the pursuit and practice of the virtues of theoretical reasoning is happiest, the other life being happy or happiest in only a secondary way or in the second rank. Thus, in completing his sketch, he maintains that, in all strictness, epsilon delta alpha iota mu omicron nu alpha is not a mere sort of activity, virtuous activity, but in fact one specific activity, the activity, as organizing principle for a whole life, of the theoretical intellect's virtues. That activity, as he puts it, is all by itself, complete or final or in-like happiness. Tau epsilon lambda epsilon alpha, epsilon delta alpha iota mu omicron nu alpha. The practical virtues, general account. The greater part of 8 of the 10 books of the Ethics concerns the practical virtues and the political life governed by them. Though the contemplative life, Cooper stresses, also achieves and sustains these values alongside contemplation. Readers often find Aristotle's general account in Book 2 disappointingly formalistic. Virtue of character as a mean between two extremes, so that each virtue has not one but two opposed vices. The novelty is deliberate. Courage is opposed not only by cowardice but by rashness. Aristotle also departs from Plato's concentration on 4 cardinal virtues, insisting on 11 co-equal virtues of character. The tripartite scheme is not mere mechanical tidiness. Non-rational desires and feelings, and actions done partly from them, are essentially continuous quantities, great or small in given circumstances. The moral virtues belong to appetite and spirit insofar as those powers can obey practical reason. Reason's function in all its aspects is to get things right by finding order, balance, and harmony. Where feelings and actions range from little to much, virtue leads one to the right strength of feeling and the right measure of action. Intermediate not as an arithmetic midpoint, but as what is properly measured relative to the circumstances. The intermediacy of the virtue reduces to the intermediacy of the feelings and actions in which reason's essential function of getting things right consists. Excess and defect are habituated over-feeling and under-feeling. Virtue is the standing condition from which one regularly feels and acts intermediately. The pleasure the virtuous take in virtuous action is pleasure in that exercise of reason, in recognizing and enacting the well-ordered intermediate. Aristotle presses the scheme case by case precisely to establish that the virtues, properly conceived, are functions of reason, not arbitrary or merely socially derived approvals. A second abstraction is equally principled. Aristotle never offers moral case studies or resolutions of conflicts in particular circumstances. Fine and just actions have a wavering quality. Clarification must speak of what is for the most part. Judgment of the mean in particular cases is given by perception. How angry to get, against whom, for how long. And neither the virtuous agent nor the philosopher can explain exactly why the right answer in a given case is precisely what it is. That does not make moral judgment a mute intuition. Aristotle offers full clarification at a level of generality, intermediacy, fineness, and a substantive picture of the virtuous agent's practical stance assembled from his remarks across the particular virtues. The next section turns to that picture. Doctrine of the mean. Each ethical virtue occupies an intermediate zone between excess and defect because reason finds order and balance on a continuous spectrum of feeling and action. Precision appropriate to the subject. Particular applications of the mean are for perception for the most part. Philosophy clarifies at generality, not by trolley case scenarios. Quote, thus the intermediacy of a moral virtue is itself a function of the fact that virtuous persons, in any specific area of life, regularly or always have the right, that is, in that sense, the intermediate feelings, and as a result they act intermediately. Thus, they feel and act in a way that is perfectly well ordered in relation to the particular circumstances for action that they face. It is in the intermediate feelings and actions belonging to or constituting the virtue that reason's essential function of getting things right by discovering good order and proper balance consists. The specific practical virtues. Morally virtuous persons, because they necessarily also possess practical wisdom, can deliberate well not merely about health or strength, but about what conduces to living well in general. Practical wisdom is a state grasping the truth, involving reason, concerned with action about things good or bad for a human being. Cooper's walk through the particular virtues reconstructs the articulate outlook that such wisdom embodies, far beyond what ordinary decent upbringing supplies. Temperance illustrates the pattern. Bodily pleasures of food, drink, and sex have a natural place, measured by natural needs for health and fitness. Those who like them more than they are worth overemphasize the beastly aspect of life. The temperate get no pleasure from what overindulgent people most enjoy. Their appetites remain moderate, seeking variety only within fitness, health, and financial means. External goods receive a parallel treatment. Considered in themselves, they are goods, but they are not always good for particular people. What one ought to wish is that these goods be good for oneself, by making oneself the sort of person for whom they are good come what may. Virtue does that. It guarantees that activities enabled by such goods will themselves be activities of virtue. Hence, the virtuous seek wealth for use in a well-lived life, and beyond that, for giving, especially to friends and to those in the community who can make good use of it. Generosity, lambda epsilon upsilon theta epsilon rho iota tau eta, crystallizes the point. Generous people know to whom to give, to those whose characters are decent. They will not enrich people who ought to be poor because their characters are bad, nor those who would flatter them. What they most value is their own actions of generosity and the concern for others' good that motivates them. Magnificence extends the same outlook to extraordinary wealth. Temples, dramatic festivals, warships, communal meals, large-scale contributions to the common good that support moral education and civilizing activities among citizens. The minor social virtues of mixing with others, friendliness, truthfulness about oneself, ready wit, are not minor for Aristotle at all. They express a default goodwill owed to cooperating partners in a naturally communal life. Treat casual contacts as one would friends, without cantankerousness or fawning, without boasting or putting on airs. Honor is the naturally appropriate badge of virtue. Yet the virtuous do not demand deference in daily interactions. They take offense at abusive disregard of citizen for citizen, not at petty slights to their own esteem, and they measure anger by the aim of restoring mutual respect. Across these analyses, virtue is not rule-following, but perfected character with philosophically articulate grounds. The generous person knows why and to whom to give. The merely decent person may feel the right way, without that structured understanding. Generosity, intermediate giving calibrated to means and to recipient's decency, valuing the act and others' moral good, not reputation or flattery. Magnificence, large-scale public expenditure for the common good and civic moral culture, not conspicuous private display. Social goodwill, default mutual regard among citizens as cooperating partners. The emotional baseline that generosity and magnificence extend. Quote, generous people know, among other ways of being intermediate in their actions and feelings, to whom they ought to be generous in giving their financial assistance. It is to those whose characters are decent, mutaro iota omicron iota tau theta eta, that they will give. They will not enrich people who ought to be poor because their characters are bad, any more than they would give to those who would flatter them and might help to spread their good reputation. Practical knowledge and ethical theory. The attitudes just sketched are those with which contemplatives, political leaders, and ordinary private persons alike approach daily life, fitting into them their special passions of theory or leadership, or living without either limelight. Decent people will have approximately the same feelings. Their understanding of why those feelings are right will not be nearly so complete, detailed, or philosophically deep. Yet on Aristotle's account, moral virtue and practical wisdom cannot exist except as a single unified condition. True moral virtue, strictly conceived, therefore requires grasp of a considerable body of philosophical analysis, the same body of knowledge as the political expertise the ethics and politics aim to produce. What we ordinarily call ethical theory is, for Aristotle, practical rather than theoretical understanding. The arguments of NEI7 about soul, reason, and virtuous activity as highest good. The doctrine of the mean as practical reason's search for order and balance on a continuous spectrum. The subordination of bodily pleasures to natural need and of external goods to virtue's power to make them good for their possessor. The vision of a community permeated by mutual respect as demanded by reason given our communal nature. None of these are ideas that good upbringing alone produces. Until Aristotle propounded the mean, Cooper notes, probably no one at all had thought in those terms. The inclusion of nameless social virtues is itself a philosophical discovery, not a report of popular morality. It is very far from true that Aristotle's ethics is conventional and conservative beside Plato and Socrates, is full of innovations deriving from a comprehensive account of human nature and communal life according to reason's prescriptions. In all happy lives, then philosophy and philosophical knowledge are key elements. Both theoretical and practical philosophy work in the contemplative life. In the others, practical philosophy plays the preeminent role. Before Cooper can say fully how philosophy is a way of life for Aristotle, however, he must return to X9's demand. Why must even the ordinary citizen and the contemplative study laws and constitutions? That is the work of the next section. Ethical theory as practical. Organized philosophical accounts of soul, value, and virtue constitute practical wisdom's knowledge base. Life-steering understanding, not detached theta epsilon omega rho alpha. Beyond conventional decency. Full virtue requires a refined philosophical self-understanding that ordinary good upbringing neither supplies nor even makes intelligible. Quote, "It is clear, then, that in all happy lives for Aristotle, philosophy and philosophical knowledge are key elements. Both theoretical and practical philosophy are at work in the contemplative life, while in the other lives, knowledge of practical philosophy plays a preeminent role. So we can now begin to see how it is that for Aristotle, philosophy, rightly conceived and rightly practiced, might be a way of life, differently in many respects from how it was for Socrates, and indeed differently within each of these three happy lives. Political community and the highest good. In the ethics, virtuous agents appear largely as individuals living alongside one another. The politics reveals that moral virtues are in a crucial way social, specifically political, accomplishments, only partly due to individual choice. Aristotle envisions a whole polis undertaking to live lives of virtue or full decency through a shared commitment that makes each agent's virtuous activities part of an overarching shared activity of the citizen body. That conception answers why anyone wishing to become good must learn about laws and constitutions. To be good is in part to engage in that communal life of shared virtue, and understanding its foundations requires political knowledge. The same conception explains why the happiest life aiming at practical virtue is the political leader's life. A kappa omicron iota omega nu alpha, for Aristotle, is at bottom a set of shared activities, not a pooled sum of private parts, but a whole belonging in common to the whole group. Subordinate communities, master, slave, family, village, involve common activities that are only part of each member's life. Only at the level of the polis do the common activities of a community according to nature coincide with all the freely engaged life activities of the participants. The polis exists for the sake of living well. Virtuous activity is the central common activity defining the polis community. Citizens pursue their own good of living in the exercise of the virtues only through pursuing that good as part of the common pursuit of the virtuous life of and for all. They treat their scheme of values as a mutually agreed basis of law and justice. Seeing neighbors live by it strengthens commitment and lends reciprocal support when virtue costs. Household education itself must be, with an eye to the Constitution, calibrating virtue to the larger political community. Aristotle makes no exception for contemplatives or private citizens. The full capacity for politics is needed by any fully virtuous person. Even the decent, whose habituation aims at the right feelings, will conceive their way of life as a communal undertaking, though without full philosophical grasp of why. Why insist on this communal framing? Partly for psychological security. Even the decent retain a human tendency to yield to immediate pleasure. Communal support reduces lapses. But even those with unwavering inner commitment would still need politics, because linking one's virtue to a whole community's virtuous life constitutes a finer, more completely realized goal, expanding the fine things virtue concerns and helps produce. The political leader expands that scope still further by overt daily exercise of virtue for the public good, especially through laws aimed at educating citizens in virtue. That is why the political life is the happiest of lives aimed at practical virtue as highest good, and still only secondarily happy beside contemplation. Koinonia as shared activity. A community is common activities belonging to the group as a whole. The natural polis makes virtuous living its central shared activity, encompassing the citizen's total free life. Why politics completes ethics. Full practical knowledge of the human good includes understanding how virtues structure communal life. Without that, even a privately virtuous life is defective relative to the secure, expanded good of shared virtue. Quote, when we do turn to the politics, we discover that Aristotle regards moral virtues and morally virtuous activities and lives as in a crucial way social, indeed, specifically political, accomplishments, a conception that hardly shows itself in ethics. They are only partly due to the choices and decisions of the individual agents who are their immediate possessors and sources. That is because, in a way that I will explain, they are, for him, parts of a communal enterprise. Conclusion. Philosophy as two ways of life. The absolutely happiest life is the contemplative one. Contemplatives put the practical virtues in control of daily, familial, social, and citizenly life, and they do so in the communal way the politics describes. But their life also includes the best and most in-like virtues, theoretical wisdom and understanding, actively employed on the highest objects of knowledge. The whole life is focused on, organized by, and aimed ultimately at that activity. This is not a life spent primarily in rapt gazing at the prime mover. It is devoted to theoretical inquiry across physics, biology, logic, metaphysics, and the rest, with knowledge of the divine first principles as culmination and constant background. Because of that passionate involvement, the contemplative life excludes the political leader's commitment. The higher good of theoretical knowledge does not so much compensate for scaled-back political activity as simply outrank it. Every fully virtuous agent, contemplative, political leader, private citizen, knows that contemplative activity is the absolutely highest human good, and that the most choice-worthy life for a polis is a contemplative one. Political leaders in a city, according to nature, will therefore support contemplatives in their midst, so that the community's shared life includes the highest activity even when most citizens' immediate contributions are limited to practical virtue. In that way, the city itself lives the absolutely happiest life for a city. Philosophy, then, is for Aristotle not one way of life, but two. The contemplative's happiness consists in constant philosophical reflection, thought, argument, and analysis. In a clear sense, the contemplative's way of life is philosophy, theoretical philosophy aimed at the full truth about reality for its own sake. That life continues Socrates' conception of philosophy as a way of life, even while replacing Socratic dialectic about the human good with constructive inquiry into first principles. Yet Socrates' topic becomes a second branch, practical philosophy, the linchpin of a practically virtuous life. Aristotle keeps his distance from those who think the contemplative life alone suits a philosopher. The practically virtuous person is the philosopher of human affairs, possessor of fully articulated practical understanding of politics in Aristotle's broad sense. For such philosophers, philosophy is not isolated in special sessions of inquiry. It is the discriminating, evaluative thinking that informs each virtuous action. Contemplatives live philosophy in a double way, as both theoretical and practical philosophers, yet their life is correctly called contemplative. For political leaders and fully virtuous private citizens who are not also accomplished theoretical philosophers, philosophy is nonetheless just as much their way of life, engaged in all the thoughts that direct the choices and activities constituting their lives. Two philosophical lives. Contemplative life equals theoretical philosophy as organizing highest good. Practical life, leader or private citizen, equals philosophy of human affairs exercised in every virtuous action. Socratic continuity, Aristotelian split. Philosophy remains a way of life, but Aristotle's distinction of practical from theoretical knowledge makes it two distinct ones, hierarchically ordered. Quote, given Aristotle's distinction, then between practical philosophy and practical knowledge on the one hand, and theoretical philosophy and theoretical knowledge on the other, philosophy for him is not a way of life, as it was for Socrates. It is two distinct ones. But for those philosophers of human affairs, virtuous political leaders, fully virtuous ordinary citizens, who are not also accomplished theoretical philosophers, philosophy is nonetheless just as much their way of life. The thinking and analysis and systematic argument and systematically organized understanding that belong to philosophy as a whole, both practical and theoretical, as its defining and distinctive characteristic, are engaged and expressed in all the thoughts that give rise to and direct all the choices, actions, and activities constituting the whole of their lives. Stoicism as a way of life. Stoicism is Cooper's high-water mark for the Socratic rationalist mainline, a complete way of life deduced from the claim that the cosmos is a single living animal whose soul is Zeus, world mind, nature, logos, and whose history is the maximally ordered product of that mind's teleological thought. Ethics sits at the system's center. Physics and dialectic are not optional ornaments, but conditions of virtue itself. Against Aristotle's freestanding nature and dual practical/theoretical lives, the Stoics reunify virtue as one rational wisdom and redefine happiness as living in agreement with the world mind's plans. Introduction: the three Hellenistic philosophies. Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum began as centers of ongoing research, not as apprenticeships in a founder's finished way of life. In the last decade of their century, that pattern changed. Epicurus opened his garden in Athens around 306 BC. A few years later, Zeno of Citium taught in the Painted Stoa. By about 268, Arcesilaus turned the Academy toward a Socratic skepticism that refused premature commitment to either rival system. By the early 3rd century, these three institutions were known not only as complete worldviews, but as sponsors of rival ways of life, places one entered to learn doctrines and, for many students, to enroll in a life. For roughly 2 centuries before and after the turn of the millennium, educated Greco-Roman culture knew philosophy primarily as Stoic, Epicurean, or skeptic. Cooper treats Stoicism first because it was philosophically dominant throughout the period. Epicureanism and skepticism stand on their own, yet each defined itself in large part as opposition to the Stoic school. The chapter that follows therefore reconstructs Stoicism as the rationalist peak against which the empiricist alternatives of Chapter 5 will be measured. Quote, by the end of the first quarter of the following century, these two new institutions were known not only as places where one might learn systematically developed, complete rival worldviews, Stoic and Epicurean, but as sponsors of rival ways of life. One went to these schools to learn the doctrines of the Epicurean or Stoic philosophy and, equally importantly, for many of the students, to enroll oneself in the Epicurean or the Stoic way of life. Stoicism, tradition, and texts. Unlike Socrates, refracted through near-contemporary dialogues, or Aristotle, whose treatises survive. Stoicism is a centuries-long tradition whose founding writings are lost. Zeno's successors grounded their work in principles they traced to him, working out what they took to be a single, complete system. Yet none of Zeno's works, and none of the Athenian schoolheads' treatises, survived into the Middle Ages from which our editions derive. We know the school through quotations, paraphrases, and reports. Diogenes Laertius and Arius Didymus assembling doctrines with little interest in supporting argument. Plutarch attacking Stoics' self-contradictions. Cicero giving a fair but selective exposition. Seneca writing as a literary lay Stoic who often downplays technical argument. Cooper therefore concentrates on the old Stoics, especially Chrysippus, the greatest and most systematic of them, while taking Roman Stoics, Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, into account as a separate matter when needed. The interpretive task is to go behind bare doctrines and reconstruct the supporting reasons it seems most likely they offered. The school petered out in the 2nd or 3rd century CE under the advance of spiritualist Platonism. What remains is a tradition that must be philosophically reanimated from fragments. Old Stoa versus Roman Stoicism. Chrysippus as systematic architect, Roman writers as carriers of the system into imperial elite life, often more rhetorical than dialectical. Evidence problem. Lost context and polemical or doxographical filters mean doctrines without arguments are often unintelligible as the Stoics themselves held them. Quote, "In what follows I concentrate primarily on what scholars call the Old Stoics of the end of the 4th and the 3rd to the early 2nd centuries BC, especially Chrysippus, the greatest and most systematic of them. Through engaging philosophically with our evidence concerning their views, I try to work out an account of the supporting reasons or analyses that it seems most likely that they offered in justification and defense of them." Stoic eudaimonism. Stoic ethics retains the eudaimonist frame shared with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Happiness, epsilon delta alpha iota mu omicron nu alpha, is the single end, specified as living in accordance with the virtues. But the Stoics add 2 characterizations absent from Aristotle. Living in agreement, mu omicron lambda omicron gamma omicron upsilon mu omega, and living in accordance with nature, and they set ethical theory inside a fully integrated account of reality whose centerpiece is a single creator God inherent in nature. That God is the source both of the world's event history and of our moral duties. Virtuous activity becomes synonymous with duty. The paradox of duty done strictly for duty's sake, yet also for the sake of happiness, rests on this foundation. In agreement, first means undivided commitment. No conflicted thoughts about how one is living. More deeply, the term has lambda gamma omicron as its root. Living in agreement means thinking some of the same thoughts the world itself thinks under Zeus's governance. The virtuous person's directing thoughts about life, circumstance, success, and failure align with the world mind's thoughts so far as these affect that life. Living in accordance with nature, by contrast, is not a mere synonym. It means living by normative principles drawn from observing how nature directs plants, animals, and ordinary human outcomes. Ethical naturalism as a second route to following Zeus's wishes. The metaphysical contrast with Aristotle is decisive. Aristotle's nature is a self-standing teleological realm. His divine mind stands outside it, thinking itself, affecting nature only as a model for assimilation in theoretical contemplation. Practical wisdom knows the human good, not God's activity hands-on. For the Stoics, reviving a Timaeus-style world animal against Aristotle's objections, divine teleological planning creates and governs nature from within. Human reason is a fragment of that world mind. In the activities of virtue, we do not merely assimilate to God while falling short. We literally think God's thoughts insofar as they concern ourselves and our lives. Living in agreement, mu omicron lambda omicron gamma omicron upsilon mu omega, zetanu, same reasoned thoughts as Zeus about one's life and actions, not mere internal consistency. Living in accordance with nature, norms inferred from natural outcomes and species patterns. distinct from, and complementary to agreement with the world mind's thoughts. Quote, but in agreement meant more than that to the Stoics. The term so translated has the word reason, lambda gamma omicron, as its root. As Chrysippus, and perhaps Zeno himself, made clear, living in agreement meant that one thinks in some way some of the same thoughts as the world itself does, the world of nature under the governance of the world mind or of the god Zeus. Stoic moral psychology and the human virtues. The clash with Aristotle is sharpest in moral psychology. Aristotelian practical virtue combines practical wisdom with mean dispositions of non-rational appetite and spirit. The Stoics, claiming Socratic pedigree, reject that division of the soul. Human virtue is psychologically a much simpler affair, a condition exclusively of the mind, of practical thoughts about actions, goals, and life. The only sources of full psychic impulse toward voluntary action are thoughts about what is worth doing or avoiding. There are no separate appetites or spirited desires as independent motivators. Bodily feelings, hunger, thirst, arousal, and pre-rational impressions are real, and they can incline, but they are not yet impulses. Impulse arises only when reason accepts that there is good enough reason to act. What Plato and Aristotle call appetites or spirited emotions are, for the Stoics, particular kinds of evaluative thoughts, often influenced by pre-rational feelings, but not identical with them. Hence, there is no second practical virtue that trains non-rational desires, only a well-trained mind that understands the actually good reasons for and against pursuits. With such a mind, one never has thoughts declaring something not worth doing to be worth doing. This analysis is the ground of the notorious rejection of emotions. Anger, grief, fear, elation, and the rest, insofar as they are motivating states, can belong only to reason. Declaring them all bad is not a demand to eradicate a permanent non-rational part of human nature, because on Stoic psychology there is no such motivating part. Pre-rational feelings may accompany even good people. What virtue banishes are motivating reactions that treat losses and irritations as worth retaliation, breastbeating, or the other behaviors of passion. The cure is understanding why such actions are never justified, after which misleading impressions themselves diminish or cease to induce. Unitary rational soul. All adult motivation is reason-based impulse. Pre-rational feelings incline, but do not move the soul to action until assent. Passions as errors of judgment. Pythedata are defective evaluative thoughts, false beliefs that something indifferent is good or bad, not independent non-rational forces to be moderated. Unity of virtue. One perfected rational condition. The named virtues are that wisdom differently contextualized. Quote, for the Stoics, and as they thought for Socrates, human virtue is psychologically a much simpler affair. It is a condition exclusively of our minds, of our practical thoughts about our actions, and about the potential goals of action, and about human life. Virtue, agreement with the world mind's plans. If virtue is agreement with the universal mind, what does that agreement involve? Stoic metaphysics pairs mind and matter as first principles. Matter is entirely passive, mind entirely active. Minds are corporeal, else they could not cause, but not material bodies of earth, air, fire, and water. Reason inherently pursues the good. The world mind, incorruptible and unobstructed, therefore produces a maximally complex, well-ordered world history. We contribute to that history through our decisions, partners of Zeus within his cosmic plan. Our nature is to live and act as such partners. The world's good is our good too. How to know what Zeus wishes. Observe how nature conducts plants, non-rational animals, and pre-rational human children. Eat and drink rightly. Exercise body and perception. Cooperate with fellows. Form stable unions for rearing. Pursue productive work. These patterns sketch the natural life. But virtue requires not merely acting on whatever inclinations we find. Many are culturally corrupted, but critically concluding that the world mind intends the impulse, whether or not the external objective is achieved. Failure of a correctly chosen objective means only that the maximally good history required something else then. Both the effort and the outcome belong to the same order. Hence, external objectives must be treated as indifferent in a carefully hedged sense. One pursues them with full differential commitment, yet remains ready to accept, even rejoice in, contrary outcomes as Zeus's decision. Indifference is therefore not absolute quietism. Health, freedom, harmonious family life, and satisfying work are according to nature as norms. Their opposites are contrary to nature in general. The virtuous prefer the positive alternatives and work vigorously to secure them when possible. What they refuse is differential regard that would make happiness turn on which condition Zeus assigns. The task of virtue remains the same in essence under any circumstances. Only the specific kappa alpha theta kappa omicron nu tau alpha change. Partners of Zeus, rational agents as subordinate parts of the world mind, contributing decisions to the maximally good world history. Hedged indifference, prefer and pursue natural objectives fully, accept success or failure without treating either as good or bad for happiness. Quote, "Our very nature, then, is to live and act as partners of Zeus in the carrying out of his plan. That is what we are here for. The amazing beauty and fantastic good order of the world, playing out over time in accordance with this cosmic plan, is therefore something that concerns us directly, insofar as we are by nature partners of the world mind, indeed subordinate parts of it, in carrying that plan out. What is good versus what is merely of some value? Folk ethics tends to treat desire satisfaction as the measure of a life's going well, and so counts health, wealth, pleasure, accomplishments, and recognition as goods. The Stoics hold this root and branch mistaken. They distinguish sharply between what is merely of some value, xi alpha, and what is actually good or bad. Goodness, following hints they find in Plato's Republic, just is rational order, the interlocking, mutually supporting order of the world animal's life, and the parallel order among a virtuous agent's actions in fit with Zeus's. Living in agreement with nature is therefore not only our highest good, but the only good we can achieve for ourselves. Every other cosmic good is Zeus's product. Particular objectives of action, a nutritious meal, saving children from fire, have real value insofar as they conform to nature's norms for our kind. They are not the right sort of thing to be good. The virtuous care about them at full strength, feel their value, and will rectify lacks when opportunity allows. Failure brings recognition that something of value is missing, not regret that one's life has been made worse. They never confuse natural value with the distinct value of rational order in one's own and the world's life. Selection of preferred indifference is thus compatible with psychological invulnerability, attachment without the judgment that happiness hangs on the outcome. Good, gem alpha theta nu, versus value, xi alpha only virtue, / living in agreement is good. Health, wealth, life, reputation, and their opposites are preferred or dispreferred indifference. Goodness as rational order. The essence of the good is perfected interconnecting order in the cosmos and in a life aligned with it. Quote, in order to capture correctly important facts about human nature and, in consequence, about what is good or bad so far as a human life is concerned, the Stoics think we must distinguish sharply between things that are merely of some value for us and those that are actually good or bad. Consequences of the Stoic theory of value. It follows that a life is not made happier or less happy by the presence or absence of naturally valuable things, nor by success or failure in obtaining them. Goodness of life is solely whether one lives in agreement with Zeus's plans. There are no degrees of happiness or virtue. Either one is living in agreement or one is not. All who are not stand equal as regards virtue and happiness, however near or far. Aristotle, counting externals and bodily conditions as goods, allows one happy life to be more blessed than another. The Stoics deny that what is added is any good at all. Eradicating the cultural error of mistaking the natural ideal for a guide to happiness is the central task of Stoic moral training. The same axiology, joined to the unitary psychology, yields the theory of appropriate acts, kappa alpha theta kappa omicron nu alpha. What is incumbent? One's place to do, Cicero's officium. All virtuous acts are appropriate, but not all appropriate acts are fully virtuous. The virtuous perform them from full understanding of the reasons. Preferred indifference, life, health, pleasure, wealth, reputation, children, and the rest, and their dispreferred contraries give content to selection. Reason-generated desires for these are not cold. The virtuous like their food, love their children, feel warmth and kindness. Affects that reason itself makes part of correct desire, not products of a separate non-rational motivator. Through kappa alpha theta kappa omicron nu, the Stoics introduce into philosophy the idea of moral duty. The virtuous life is life always doing one's duty for duty's sake, because God has imposed those actions as our place in the world order. The famous paradoxes: only virtue is good. Virtue suffices for happiness. All faults are equal. Every non-sage is mad. Only the wise are free and rich, are theorems of this system, not rhetorical excesses. Cooper's point is that once the cosmic and psychological premises are granted, the paradoxes become intelligible and deserve serious engagement. No degrees of happiness, agreement or not, preferred indifference neither increase nor diminish eudaimonia. Kappa alpha theta kappa omicron nu / duty, naturally appropriate acts as divine prescriptions, virtue as doing duty for duty's sake within eudaimonism. Preferred indifference, pyromicron egum alpha, selectables with axia, pursued with feeling, never mistaken for goods. Quote, for the Stoics, what is naturally appropriate for us derives from decisions and prescriptions of God, the creator and sustainer of the world order. If we act virtuously, we act appropriately not only because doing that suits our nature and is good for us, but because God has imposed on us just those actions as things for us to do. We do them in obedience to this divine command. Through their concept of the kappa alpha theta kappa omicron nu act, then, the Stoics introduced into philosophy the idea of moral duty. Stoic versus Aristotelian conceptions of emotions or passions. Non-virtuous adults' desires are also reason-derived, but defective. They treat merely valuable things as good, and so become excessive passions. Chrysippus systematized this taxonomy to show how misevaluation subjects the soul to upheaval, because one then thinks one's very happiness hangs on uncontrollable outcomes. The popular image of the Stoic as affectless and hard-hearted is false. Stoic life is full of naturally appropriate feeling. But the rejection of pytheta is not terminological quibbling. True Stoics do not grieve when a child dies, do not anger at insult, do not pity suffering, do not elate at success, do not fall into possessive infatuation. They may feel recognition that something belonging to the natural ideal has been lost. That feeling, imbued with care for the world's order, is not grief of any degree. Aristotle agrees that passion's essence involves taking its object as good or bad, but his broader theory of goods makes moderate passions on suitable occasions positively good, metriopathia. The Stoics hold every instance thoroughly bad, apatheia as freedom from passion, not from all effect. The disagreement is grounded in value theory, not in raw emotional intuition. Cooper refuses easy dismissal. Each theory is a coherent development from an impressive outlook on nature. Each gives an intelligible account of emotion's place. He would find it hard to decide between them on philosophical grounds of value alone, even though they cannot both be right. The acrasia challenge, apparent simultaneous opposition of reason and emotion, does not, Cooper argues, settle the matter. Socrates, Aristotle, and Chrysippus all refuse the ordinary description of acting while still deciding not to. Chrysippus proposes rapid oscillation of reason's acceptances rather than two co-present motivators from different psychic parts. Experiential evidence does not clearly prove non-rational adult motivations. The dispute remains one of high theory. Apatheia versus metriopathia. Stoic extirpation of passions versus Aristotelian moderation. Same-named states, opposite moral verdicts, rooted in rival axiologies. Akrasia as oscillation, apparent dual motivation reanalyzed as rapid switching of rational assent, not proof of a non-rational part. Quote, exactly those conditions of mind, some of which Aristotle thinks not only not bad, but positively good, to experience, the Stoics think are uniformly, and in all instances, bad things to feel, blights to one's life. Instead, we must take very seriously the much more fundamental disagreement between Stoics and Aristotle in the general theory of values. Each of their respective theories is a coherent and impressive development. The Stoic way of life. The paradoxes become livable only when grasped from Stoic first principles about nature and our place in it. For Socrates, philosophy is authority, internal motivator, and central occupation of the best life. Aristotle keeps the first two, but makes ongoing formal study central only in the contemplative life. The Stoics go further. All philosophy becomes practical. Physics and dialectic are themselves virtues. One cannot be truly just, temperate, or courageous without knowing the system down to principles of being. Yet, day by day, formal study becomes, in principle, optional once the understanding is secured. Reason's point is governance of life in agreement with nature, not contemplation as a separate peak. The fully persuaded Stoic organizes all pursuits under living virtuously as agreement with Zeus. Habituation is of the mind, training out misleading impressions that paint preferred indifference as good or bad, installing patterns of thought and feeling that represent them at their true natural value, strengthening spontaneous resort to Stoic distinctions. At the center stands the conviction that one's only good is the order one establishes among objectives and attitudes as co-worker of God in the world's beautiful life. That outlook yields a deep respect for all human beings as equally partners of cosmic reason, a moral egalitarianism new to antiquity and a seed of later dignity and rights talk. Even while Stoics remain pessimistic about most people's moral success and did not infer democratic politics. The way of life is thus living from continuous rational evaluation, selecting preferred indifference without passionate attachment, performing kappa alpha theta kappa omicron ut alpha as divine prescriptions, accepting outcomes as parts of the world mind's plan. Progressors, not sages, are the realistic agents. Their lives remain miserable by strict definition, yet vastly improved over ordinary misevaluation. Against Aristotle's dualism, Stoicism reunifies Socratic intellectualism under a single deductive system grounded in cosmic theology, the most rigorous unified pagan answer to the Socratic question before the empiricist and Plotinian turns. Philosophy is practical throughout, physics and dialectic as virtues, formal study ancillary once understanding governs life. Habituation of reason, train impressions and evaluative patterns, not a separate non-rational desiderative faculty. Moral egalitarianism, all rational beings as Zeus's partners, fulfillment available in any station, including slavery. Quote, at the center of their habituation, Stoics accustom themselves to thinking that their only good, just as with the overall good of the world and its life, consists in the good order they have established among, on the one hand, the external objects and circumstances they attempt to bring about or to preserve and to make use of and enjoy, and on the other, their own attitudes and ways of approaching them. Crucial to the latter is the conviction that contributing to the wonderfully beautiful, well-ordered life of the whole world is their highest objective. Intimately connected to this central idea is the further idea that in making that contribution, we become God's co-workers. The Epicurean and skeptic ways of life. Cooper pairs the two major empiricist alternatives to the Socratic, Aristotelian, Stoic rationalist mainline. Both Epicureans and skeptics refuse the claim that human reason has divine affiliation sufficient to go behind appearances and authoritatively decide the scheme of values for a human life. Both still construct complete philosophies, with accounts of tranquility, daily conduct, and, in Epicurus's case, virtue, yet both diminish or suspend the role that perfected reason plays as steersman in chapters 2 to 4. The chapter's drama is that contrast, where Stoics deify reason, Epicureans subordinate it to feeling, and skeptics turn it against every dogmatic claim. Introduction. For Socrates, Aristotle, and the Stoics, and for Plato and the Platonists of the next chapter, devotion to reason lies at the center of the best life. Reason does not merely explain and justify that life. It guides agents as they lead it, and it earns that authority partly because of its divine origins or affiliations. Epicurus and the ancient skeptics, academic and Pyrrhonian, reject that conception. They do not accept that human reason has powers of insight sufficient of themselves to reach a divinely ordained truth about reality and the human good. Epicurus naturalizes reason into a modest animal power grounded in and strictly limited by sensation and feeling. Ultimate truth is found only there. Reason is memory and wary generalization from sensory experience, including cautious inference to atoms and void, with no legitimate ambition to grasp divinely given essences. Correspondingly, the Epicurean way of life depends on Epicurus's arguments and conclusions, but it does not require full mastery of those arguments as a prerequisite to virtue and happiness. Firm memory of the fundamental doctrines can steer the life. Active philosophical inquiry is not an essential component of the best life in the Socratic sense. The skeptics go further still. They use philosophical reason to suspend judgment on every dogmatic claim about how things are by nature, and they live by following appearances. Cooper treats the two together as Hellenistic philosophy's empiricist wing, rival life programs that still belong to the ancient project of philosophy as comprehensive guidance, but that refuse the mainline's confidence in reason's cosmic authority. Quote, neither Epicurus and his many followers, nor the ancient skeptics, both academic and Pyrrhonian, accept this conception of human reason as having divine affiliations that give it some unique power and value. They do not accept, with these mainline philosophers, that human reason has powers of insight and judgment sufficient of themselves to go behind appearances and reach a divinely ordained truth about reality, so as to decide authoritatively about human good and bad. Ch. 5, section chapter 5, verse 1. Epicurus's theory of the human good. Everyone who knows Epicurus's name knows his high regard for pleasure. Experience, he holds, teaches that pleasure is the only thing valuable just in itself, the only intrinsic good. Cicero reports the famous cradle argument as the beginning of the doctrine. Newborn animals, uncorrupted by culture, instinctively seek pleasure and avoid pain. Cooper stresses that Epicurus offers this less as a formal proof than as a restorative reminder. Adults already know, in the feeling of desire and its satisfaction, that pleasure is their natural good. Socialization has taught them to disparage it and to treat health, virtue, or power as if they were goods in themselves. The cradle argument strips away those accretions and restores attention to what nature was telling us from the start. The decisive refinement is the distinction between kinetic and catastematic pleasure. Kinetic pleasure accompanies bodily and psychic movements, eating when hungry, sexual excitement, the stir of favorite activities. Catastematic pleasure is the stable awareness of a healthy, pain-free constitution, absence of bodily pain, pi omicron alpha, and of mental disturbance, tau alpha or alpha's alpha. Epicurus counts the catastematic state as the greatest pleasure, not because it is more intense, but because it is purest. Intense kinetic pleasures are typically mixed with the stress of the desires that produce them. Intensity is no measure of quantity. When one enjoys catastematic pleasure, nothing of pleasure's value is missing. Kinetic pleasures do not increase that quantity. They vary it, preferred colorings of the same platform of healthy consciousness. Empty or groundless desires, infatuations, addictions, the gourmand's peremptory craving for lobster, undermine the platform by introducing needless distress. Natural and necessary desires, hunger, thirst, and the like, remain. The wise person satisfies them without intensity and peremptoriness, and plans a life full of favorite variations that sustain interest without destroying repose. Atomist physics underwrites the ethics. Gods exist, but they do not intervene. Death is the dispersal of the soul's atoms, and so nothing to us. Fear of the gods and fear of death are primary sources of mental disturbance. True understanding eliminates them and clears the way for continuous katastematic pleasure. Katastematic pleasure, the stable, pure awareness of bodily painlessness and mental tranquility, the highest quantity of pleasure, not exceeded by any intensity of kinetic excitement. Kinetic variation, favorite activities color and sustain katastematic consciousness without increasing it. Empty desires destroy the platform they pretend to enrich. Quote, in the first set of circumstances, the feeling of pleasure comes into being because of, and in accompaniment with bodily and psychic movements. The pleasure can be called a kinetic pleasure. The second is a pleasure in the awareness of the healthy functioning of one's own natural constitution, physical and psychic. Ch. 5, section chapter 5, verse 2. The Epicurean way of life. Virtue, irreligion, friendship. If pleasure alone is intrinsically good, virtue cannot be good in the Stoic or Aristotelian sense. Epicurus reconceives justice, courage, temperance, and the rest as necessary instruments for achieving and securing katastematic pleasure, and more subtly, as among the favorite ways of varying that pleasure, immediately pleasant in their exercise. Temperance follows almost immediately. The wise will not chase intense, impure kinetic pleasures that disrupt repose. Courage is harder. Epicurus is entitled to trim the popular conception toward a quieter life, but Cooper argues at the core, willingness to risk serious harm for family, friends, and the structures that secure one's future pleasure can survive if future security is given supreme weight. Justice is a mutual pact, not to harm or be harmed. The unjust person can never be confident of escaping detection. Fear of exposure destroys tau alpha rho alpha xi alpha. Hence, on Epicurus's own terms, one must never knowingly do injustice. Not because just action is intrinsically fine apart from pleasure, but because the psychology of detection anxiety makes injustice self-defeating. Irreligion is the second pillar. Epicurean gods are blessed paradigms of continuous happiness, not governors of the world. Myths of divine punishment, including those spread by well-meaning philosophers like Plato, are to be cleared away. The third pillar is the maxim, live unnoticed, lambda theta epsilon beta iota sigma alpha, a private life without public ambition, defaulting away from politics except where security genuinely requires exposure. Friendship is the greatest resource wisdom provides for a blessed life, not a narrow utilities of favors, but a partnership of those fulfilled in their pleasures, supplying security, shared favorite activities, and, in friends continuing love after one's death, the only immortal good an Epicurean world allows. Cicero charged that pleasure theory cannot support loving another ipsum propter ipsum. Cooper replies that taking immediate pleasure in a friend's pleasure may preserve what the pre-theoretical demand for their own sake legitimately requires. Instrumental virtue, wisdom, temperance, courage, and justice serve katastematic pleasure as causal conditions and as immediately pleasant variations, not as goods independent of feeling. Justice as security pact, mutual non-harm. Undetected injustice is psychologically impossible to count on, so the just life is the only stable, pleasant life. Friendship, the greatest resource for blessedness, security, shared variation of pleasure, and a mortal's only immortality in others' memory. Quote, it is impossible for one who violates any of the things agreed to for the sake of not harming or being harmed by one another to be confident that he will escape detection, even if from the present time forward he has tens of thousands of escapes. For it is unclear up to death whether he will in fact escape detection. Epicurus, Principal Doctrines 35, ch. 5, section chapter 5, verse 3. The Epicurean life. Concluding summary. Draw the threads together. Epicureans live convinced of a materialist physics. Atoms and void, chance worlds, gods without providence. Death as the end of consciousness. Memorized from the letter to Herodotus and ready for recall whenever foreboding threatens equanimity. They concentrate on the here and now, steering by the ethical precepts of the letter to Mencius and the principal doctrines. Pleasure is the sole intrinsic good. Catastematic self-consciousness is the greatest pleasure. Practical wisdom transforms motivations so that desires conform to that knowledge. They retreat, where possible, into a small world of family and like-minded friends, the garden as model, exercising Epicurean temperance, courage, and justice as self-protection and as favorite activities. Handmaidens of pleasure though the virtues are, they can be valued for their own sake insofar as they are immediately pleasant. What Epicurus will not grant is valuation of virtue without reference to pleasure at all. Was this a philosophical way of life in the full Socratic sense? It was grounded in distinctive tenets and steered by firm belief in them. But Cooper's answer to the further questions is largely negative. Epicurus's naturalized reason does not require deep critical grasp of the chains of argument behind the tenets. Memory and a solid feeling of conviction suffice. Hence, the movement was open to the little educated. There is no essential place for constant Socratic inquiry, Aristotelian theory for its own sake, or even Stoic renewal of knowledge through ongoing philosophical discussion. When Epicurus says one must philosophize while laughing and keeping house, the philosophizing he means is making the tenets evident in a happy life, whether or not one has reasoned them through for oneself. Quote, "It is impossible to live pleasantly without living prudently and honorably and justly, and it is impossible to live prudently and honorably and justly without living pleasantly." Epicurus, Letter to Mencius, ch. 5, section chapter 5, verse 4. Ancient skepticism, living without believing anything. Modern skepticism is primarily an epistemological force. What are the requirements for knowledge, and does anyone meet them? Ancient skepticism, as Cooper recovers it through Sextus Empiricus, is first of all ethical. The central question is how to live well. Doubts about knowledge, and even about the truth of assertions, are means to an ethical end. Tranquility, tau for alpha's alpha, not freestanding theoretical positions. Sextus's skeptics say they live without believing anything in the dogmatic, reason-justified sense, without claims that things are by nature thus and so, backed by philosophical reasons. They live contentedly on the basis of that lack. Historically, Sextus stands in a Pyrrhonian line that Cooper traces through Eniesidemus in the 1st century BCE, who appealed to the shadowy Pyrrho as ancient sponsor and who, Cooper argues, invented skepticism as a way of life by placing the ethical concern at the center. Academic skepticism, Arcesilaus and successors, had already practiced negative examination of Stoic and other doctrines. Eniesidemus, disillusioned with later academic developments under Philo and Antiochus, reforged the practice into a complete life program. Cooper's focus remains Sextus's outlines. There the skeptic way of life receives its fullest ancient articulation. Quote, "The good and happy life that skepticism makes possible is indeed one led without claims to know anything. In particular, to know what is good and bad, in general, or to know that the way one is living really is the best one. They live their lives, or so they say, without so much as believing anything at all." Ch. 5, section chapter 5, verse 5. The Pyrrhonian skepticism of Sextus Empiricus. Sextus narrates the causal origin of skepticism in the anxiety of certain smart and energetic people at the anomaly in things. A tower looks round from a distance and flat-sided up close. A stick looks bent underwater. Something pleasant harms health. Ordinary people shrug and muddle through pragmatically. The proto-skeptics could not. They accepted the philosopher's distinction between appearance and reality in the nature of things, and they felt they could not live responsibly until they knew which side of each anomaly was true and why. So they sought tranquility through positive philosophy, Platonic, Aristotelian, Epicurean, Stoic, hoping reason theories would resolve the anomalies. What they found was equipollence. Every school had good arguments. Every school had good arguments against it. Inventive critical reason could always find something countervailing. The skill of the full-blown skeptic is the perfection of that critical power, always to find an opposition that forces a well-prepared mind to withhold final judgment, epiche. Tranquility followed suspension not by design, but, as a shadow follows a body, the unexpected gift of giving up the exhausting search. Epiche is not irrationality. It is reason applied by philosophy's own standards until dogmatism collapses. The skeptic continues to investigate, but without the dogmatic hope that investigation will yield a finally justified account of natures. Epiche, suspension of judgment on how things are by nature, forced by equal arguments on both sides. The skeptic's perfected critical skill. Tranquility as shadow. Tau for alpha's alpha follows suspension unexpectedly. It is not a dogmatic end secured by a theory of the good. Quote, thus these proto-skeptics developed what Sextus describes as the specific skill of the full-blown skeptic, skill in being able always to find an opposition, of such a sort as to cause any rationally well-prepared mind to withhold a final judgment. Ch. 5, section chapter 5, verse 6. The skeptic way of life. How, then, does one live without dogmatic beliefs? Not by inactivity. Skeptics follow appearances. Phiophiotinum u epsilon nu alpha, they accept, without claiming reasons, that the tower looks flat-sided, that hunger presses toward food, that this action seems required. Acceptance is active, yet feels automatic, habit sweeping one along. Against the worry that such a life would dissolve into idiosyncratic chaos, Sextus lists fourfold everyday observances that structure every skeptic life. 1. Direction by nature. We perceive and think as human nature dictates. 2. Necessitation by passive affection. Hunger conducts to food, thirst to drink. 3. Handing down of laws and customs. We accept in an everyday way that acting piously is good and impiously bad. 4. Teaching of professional occupations. We are not inactive in the crafts we accept. All this is said without expressing opinions for which reasons could be demanded. The result is a radical departure from the Socratic project. Reason is preserved as the critical method that produces epiche, but abandoned as the source of life-guiding truth about the good. Virtue in the elitist sense of the positive schools drops out. The skeptic does not distinguish himself from the run of life around him by a reasoned grasp of natures. He conforms, non-dogmatically, to nature, affection, custom, and craft. Philosophy becomes a self-consuming therapy. It cures the anxiety it helped create by teaching one to stop demanding what positive philosophy promised and could not deliver. Fourfold observances: nature, affections, laws and customs, professional teaching. The positive content of skeptic life without dogmatic belief. Following appearances: action without reason-justified belief that things are by nature as they appear. Quote, thus, attending to that which appears, we live in accordance with everyday observances, withholding opinions, for we are not able to be utterly inactive. These everyday observances seem to be fourfold, and to consist in 1. Direction by nature, 2. Necessitation by passive affection, 3. Handing down of laws and customs, and 4. Teaching of professional occupations. Sextus outlines I-23 to 24, ch. 5, section chapter 5, verse 7. Platonism as a way of life. The final chapter turns from Hellenistic empiricism to late ancient Platonism through Plotinus, the spiritualized culmination of the pagan philosophical tradition, where classical and Hellenistic philosophers located happiness, at least partly within embodied animal life. Plotinus identifies the true self with intellect alone and locates happiness exclusively in contemplative assent. Philosophy becomes both the sole means to that life and, at its peak, the life itself. The epilogue then traces the tradition's demise. Iamblichus's theurgy subordinates reason to ritual, and Augustine's Christianity offers the personal God that pagan Platonism could not. Introduction: Pythagoras, Plato, and ancient Greek wisdom. In Hellenistic and early imperial times, Stoicism was the prestige philosophy. Epicureans and skeptics were minority outriders. Yet dissatisfaction with materialist and corporealist assumptions was already growing. Philosophers who experienced themselves as spiritual beings found their most persuasive articulation in Plato's dialogues, and traced that wisdom further back, fancifully, through Pythagoras to a primordial nearness to the gods. By the middle of the 3rd century CE, independent Greek philosophy largely meant Platonism, putting oneself intellectually in touch with true being and living for the soul's return to its origin. Cooper insists on a sharp contrast with everything preceding. For Socrates, Aristotle, Stoics, Epicureans, and even for Plato in the Republic and Phaedo, as Cooper reads them, philosophy addresses human beings as animals in this world. Knowledge of forms, where Plato invokes it, serves this worldly virtue and happiness, ruling the city, living resolutely until death comes. Late Platonism reverses the vector. Philosophy's task is not to enrich embodied life, but to disengage us from it. We are not, in truth, embodied things at all. Our life lies in pure intellectual thinking, most of us without realizing it. Happiness requires not regarding yourself as an animal. Your animal life, however well lived, is not part of your good. Plotinus, 205 to 270 CE, writing at Rome, receives the fullest treatment because he offers the first philosophically rich, self-critical exposition of this system. Later Platonists work within his framework even when they depart from him. Quote, "In turning to Plotinus and late Platonism, we step into a different philosophical world. The value and function of philosophy for these Platonists is not to enrich and deepen our life as animals, but, much more, to disengage us and take us away from it, even while we are, perforce, living it." Ch. 6, section chapter 6, verse 1. Plotinus's Platonist metaphysics. Before the theory of the human person can be understood, Cooper situates it in Plotinus's metaphysics of intelligible being, the great triad of basic substances that is Platonism's divine trinity, the one, intellect and soul. The governing principle is that the natures or essences of natural objects and properties, Platonic forms, are not located in the sensory world at all. They're instantiated there, but they themselves belong to a higher realm. The impulse to philosophy is the impulse to wonder what a nature is. The one is beyond being and thought, absolute, self-contained, so overfull of reality that it overflows and generates being. First, it generates intellect, pneumomachron, the realm of forms thought timelessly as a unified system of intellectual structures. Then, by further emanation, intellect generates soul, psiupsilankai. Soul also understands the whole system of forms, but as principles for organizing the physical world, spelled out, instangible natures, red, dog, that moves soul to create and direct the cosmos by casting reflections of forms into matter. Soul ranks third. The human task is to reverse the cascade, ascend from concern with soul's products through intellect toward the one. Philosophy, especially dialectic as systematic study of forms and their interrelations, is the method of that return. The one, beyond being, ineffable source whose overflow generates all else. Intellect, true being, forms as a unified, timeless system of thought. Soul, mediating substance, forms as instangible natures, creator and director of the physical world. Quote, "The one is so overfull of reality that it overflows and therein generates being and beings. First it generates intellect, and then intellect generates a third eternal entity and substance, soul." Ch. 6, section chapter 6, verse 2. Plotinus's theory of the human person. There are strictly no additional soul entities beyond soul the substance, only distinguishable ways soul works in the world. At successive levels, soul constitutes materials, living functions, animal consciousness, and in humans, empirical reasoning. The decisive fifth level is intellect, soul giving itself intact, not via an image. Within a human consciousness taken as a whole, the person is the intellect. The rest, senses, appetites, spirited emotions, even hybrid discursive planning about particulars, belongs to a soul image, epsilon delta omega lambda omicron nu, attached to us. The soul image is ours. It is not us. This claim answers what Cooper calls the spiritual crisis of the early centuries CE, the sense of a self-conscious, alien to the material world. Plotinus's salvation is metaphysical identification with intellect, which already, implicitly, thinks forms whenever we classify and reason, and which can turn explicitly upward toward forms or downward toward the embodied life. Freedom is the power to orient that attention. So long as we live, we cannot ignore what is below. Ethics concerns the spirit in which we combine upward and downward focus, never mistaking the lower life for the life of the true self. True self as intellect. We, the true human beings, are our intellects. The soul image is attached, not identical. Upward/downward tension. Freedom as the intellect's power to focus on forms or on embodied concerns. The hinge of Plotinian ethics. Quote, thus each of us, the human person we individually are, is exclusively this part of our soul that is this part of our consciousness. We, what Plotinus calls the true human beings, are our intellects. The soul image is not us, it is only ours. Ch. 6, section chapter 6, verse 3. Virtue and happiness. Because we are intellects who must still oversee a living body, virtue is complex. Plotinus articulates three hierarchical levels of the cardinal virtues. Civic virtues, level 3, belong to the soul image. Popular and civic qualities produced by habit and exercise, scheduling non-rational desires and practical assents, so that embodied life is decently managed. Plotinus's attitude here is ambivalent. He inherits the Phaedo's disparagement of civic virtue as shadow drawing, yet he also needs an account of how the purified person looks downward without collusion. Purifying virtues, level 2, belong to intellect turning upward and refusing to mix with bodily passions. Wisdom as upward turn, temperance as refusal of mixture, courage as fearlessness of death, justice as intellect ruling without lower interference. Intellectual virtues, level 1, are the fully purified intellect's contemplation of forms. Happiness is exclusively the activity of the highest level. Civic life is necessary management of an alien vehicle, not part of happiness. The happy person despises bodily and social so-called goods, seeking them only as necessities that protect contemplative serenity. Death is better than life with the body. Non-rational impulses are to be quieted into slight shocks, never adopted as the self's own. Plotinus stoicizes agency. Virtuous action issues from reasoned assent alone, while retaining a Platonist soul image the Stoics denied. Daily life holds little interest except as the scene of purification. Platitudes suffice for its care because the happy person's thoughts are elsewhere, above. Three-level virtue, civic soul image, purifying, intellect ascending, intellectual, intellect contemplating. Happiness only at the top. Non-mixture. The true self does not share the body's desires or evaluations. It oversees the body without collusion. Quote, the happy person will actually despise all the bodily and social so-called goods. The happy person thinks we should seek these only as what can reasonably be called necessities. Ch. 6, section chapter 6, verse 5. Philosophy. The soul way up to life itself. For Plotinus and the late Platonists generally, philosophy is doubly a philosophical life. It is the sole necessary means to happiness. Through dialectic, purification, and the reorientation of attention away from the physical. In its highest activity, contemplative understanding of forms and ultimately of the One is happiness, the very essence of the good life, not a preparation for something else. All philosophical study, whatever the topic, has its principal value in that uplifting force. Even reading a treatise on physics or ethics is an activity of intellect purifying itself. Later commentators, such as Ammonius and Simplicius, could read Aristotle as a path of ascent for the same reason. Every genuine exercise of intellect serves the return. This is the furthest intensification of Cooper's theme. Where Epicurus made philosophy optional once the maxims were memorized, and where the skeptic used philosophy to undo philosophy's dogmatic ambitions, Plotinus makes philosophy both road and destination. There is no happy life that is not a philosophical life in the strictest sense, and no merely civic or customary excellence that can substitute for the ascent of intellect. Quote, for Plotinus, and the late ancient Platonists in general, philosophy is the sole road to happiness and also its very essence. Thus, the Platonist way of life is doubly a philosophical life. The practice of philosophy is the sole necessary means to happiness. Moreover, the highest level of active philosophical understanding is happiness. It is the very essence of happiness. Ch. 6, section chapter 6, verse 6. Epilogue. The demise of pagan philosophy and of philosophy as a way of life. After Plotinus, the tradition diverges momentously. Porphyry remained a close adherent. Aemilius and then Iamblichus, d. ca. 325, established a Syrian Neoplatonism that revised the purely rationalist spirit of Plotinus's work. Christianity, Gnosticism, and Platonism already competed as rival salvation systems, sharing belief in a first God and in souls imprisoned in alien matter. For Plotinus and Porphyry, salvation was attainable only through philosophical understanding and purifying virtue, culminating in contemplative insight into the One. Iamblichus continued to philosophize, but he added ritualistic utterances and performances of a religious, unphilosophical kind. Salvation no longer depended on depth of understanding and progressive separation from the physical world. It depended on a different connection to the gods through what scholars call theurgical ritual. In short, for Iamblichus, salvation depended on pagan religious magic. He had a philosophical reason. The soul was damaged in its descent into matter, so reascent by purely intellectual means, as Plotinus assumed, was impossible. Theurgy supplies the deficiency. Ancestral Egyptian, Chaldean, and Hellenic rites were thereby placed on a Platonist foundation. After Iamblichus, Platonism became as much a religious as a philosophical movement. The reverse contamination of philosophy by religion matching Christianity's absorption of Greek philosophical tools. Platonism looked increasingly like one more religious option among Gnostic and Christian strands. That is how it appeared to Augustine of Hippo d. 430. Dissatisfied with a materialistic life and anxious as a blank self-conscious I in an alien world, he turned first to Plotinus, Porphyry, and Iamblichus. He admired the Platonist commitment to self-salvation, but philosophical thought, even burdened with Iamblichian ritual, did not suffice. He needed a personal God and Father of the kind only Christianity could give. He became a Christian. Justinian's closure of the Athenian school, 529 CE, was the external end. The internal end had already come when philosophy ceased to trust reason alone. The Socratic project, living from reason understanding as steersman of life, dissolved back into religion. Theurgy, Iamblichus ritual as necessary for salvation because the descended soul is too damaged for purely intellectual reascent. Cooper's decisive contamination of philosophy by religion. Augustine's choice, admiration for Platonist self-salvation, then Christianity's personal God. The pagan philosophical way of life yields to a religion that could use philosophy without being limited to it. Quote, Instead, it depended on a different kind of connection to the gods, through what the modern scholarly tradition calls theurgical ritual utterances and performances. In short, for Iamblichus, salvation depended on pagan religious magic. Ch. 6, section chapter 6, verse 7. Quote, Augustine admired the purity of the Platonist commitment to self-salvation, but remained dissatisfied. Augustine felt he needed a personal God and Father, of the kind that only the Christian religion could give him. He became a Christian. Ch. 6, section chapter 6, verse 7. Conclusion. Cooper's pursuits of wisdom reframes a millennium of ancient ethics, not as prologue to modern moral theory, but as a single, contested tradition united by one question. Can rigorous philosophical argument function as the steersman of a human life? The 6 ways of life he examines are rival answers still worth weighing. If one accepts, even provisionally, the Socratic assumptions modernity largely abandoned. The arc is clear once the chapters are read in order. Socrates originates the project, care of the soul above all else, virtue as wisdom, the best life as continuous phi iota lambda omicron sigma omicron phi alpha, pursuing unattainable divine sigma omicron phi alpha. Aristotle bifurcates that unity into contemplative and political happinesses, grounded in practical versus theoretical knowledge, and completed only in the politics. Stoicism reunifies virtue as single rational wisdom deduced from cosmic logos, virtue as sole good, preferred indifference, passions as errors of judgment, apatheia against Aristotelian metriopatheia. Epicureans and skeptics offer empiricist alternatives, catastematic pleasure with instrumental virtue, or epike with the fourfold observances. Plotinus intensifies the project until philosophy is both means and essence of assent. The epilogue then shows the demise. Iamblichus's theurgy and Augustine's Christianity dissolving the Socratic trust that reason alone can steer a life. Cooper's central analytical cut, living from verses merely in accordance with one's philosophy, explains why contemporary academic philosophy cannot be a way of life in the ancient sense without recovering something like the 3 Socratic assumptions. The book's ultimate gesture is an invitation, not a proof. Someone who comes to philosophy hoping it will alter life for the better may find the ancient philosophies, studied in the spirit they were written, the only viable resource. Whether those assumptions can still persuade us remains open. What the examination makes undeniable is that the ancients took the question with a seriousness most modern philosophy departments have forgotten. Cooper's pursuits of wisdom reframes a millennium of ancient ethics, not as prologue to modern moral theory, but as a single, contested tradition united by one question. Can rigorous philosophical argument function as the steersman of a human life? The 6 ways of life he examines are not museum pieces, but rival answers still worth weighing. If one accepts, even provisionally, the Socratic assumptions modernity abandoned. Living from verses. In accordance with Cooper's central analytical distinction, one was to live one's life from, not just in accordance with, one's philosophy, separates the ancient steersman model from modern rule-following, and exposes why contemporary academic philosophy cannot be a way of life in the ancient sense. Socrates as origin and paradigm. The notional Socrates of Plato's Apology originates the project, care of the soul above all else, virtue as wisdom, the best life as continuous philosophical inquiry, phi iota lambda omicron sigma omicron phi alpha, pursuing unattainable divine wisdom, sigma omicron phi alpha, setting the terms every subsequent school accepts, modifies, or rejects. Aristotle's bifurcation, 2 happy lives, contemplative and political, grounded in practical versus theoretical knowledge and the doctrine of the mean. The first major complication of Socratic unity and the problem Stoicism attempts to solve. Stoic reunification, a single deductive system from cosmic theology to apatheia, virtue as sole good, passions as errors of judgment, living in agreement with logos as the high-water mark of pagan rationalism. Empiricist alternatives. Epicurean instrumental virtue in service of katastematic pleasure, and skeptic epike with fourfold observances, both grounding life in sensation while constructing complete philosophies that challenge reason's cosmic authority. Plotinus and the demise. Philosophy as ascent of intellect to the One, doubled as means and essence of happiness. Before Iamblichus's theurgy and Augustine's Christianity dissolved the Socratic commitment to reason sufficiency. The tradition ends by becoming the religion it originally defined itself against. The book's ultimate gesture is an invitation, not a proof. Someone who comes to philosophy hoping it will alter life for the better may find the ancient philosophies, studied in the spirit they were written, the only viable resource. Whether the three Socratic assumptions can still persuade us is Cooper's open question. What his forensic examination makes undeniable is that the ancients took the question with a seriousness most modern philosophy departments have forgotten. Quote, one was to live one's life from, not just as one could put it in accordance with one's philosophy. Your philosophy did not just guide your life, it steered your life directly from its implanted position in your mind and character. Quote, one was to live one's life from, not just as one could put it, in accordance with one's philosophy. Your philosophy did not just guide your life, it steered your life directly from its implanted position in your mind and character. Key persons discussed. Socrates, notional originator of philosophy as way of life in Plato's Apology and Socratic dialogues. Plato expands Socratic care of the soul into metaphysics and psychology. Backdrop for Plotinus. Aristotle, Two Happy Lives, Practical versus Theoretical Knowledge. Inni, Politics Architectonic. Zeno/Chrysippus/later Stoics. Reunification of Virtue. Cosmic Logos, Preferred Indifference. Epicurus, Katastematic Pleasure, Instrumental Virtue, Irreligion and Friendship. Pyrrho/Sextus Empiricus. Epike, Fourfold Observances, Living by Appearances. Plotinus, True Self as Intellect, Three-Level Virtue, Philosophy as Ascent. Iamblichus, Theurgy, Ritual Salvation when intellect alone cannot reascend. Augustine, turns from Platonism to Christianity's personal God. Pierre Hadot, Couperes principal contemporary interlocuteur spirituel exercice. John M. Cooper, analytic historian of ancient ethics, author of this study. Key works discussed. Pursuits of Wisdom, Cooper, 2012. The Present Study. 6 Ways from Socrates to Plotinus. Plato, Apology/Protagoras, Socratic Mission, Power of Knowledge of the Good. Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics and Politics, 2 Lives, Ethics as Part of Political Science. Stoic Fragments/Epictetus/Marcus, Living in Agreement, Passions as Judgments. Epicurus, Letter to Mencius/Principal Doctrines, Pleasure, Virtue, Gods. Sextus Empiricus, Outlines of Pyrrhonism, Skeptic Way of Life. Plotinus, Enneads, Metaphysical Triad, True Human Being as Intellect. Hadot, Ancient Philosophy as Way of Life. Rival Framing Cooper corrects. Index of Key Concepts. Way of Life, complete, reason-grounded guide to living, not academic specialty alone. Living from / in accordance with, steersman implanted in character versus external precepts. 3 Socratic assumptions. Reason motivates, philosophy perfects reason, knowledge of good is decisive. Steersman, Kappa Upsilon Beta Epsilon Rho Nu Tau Eta, philosophy, steering life from within. Sophia, Pistimi, Divine Wisdom Vies, Temporary Human Knowledge, Socrates. Unity of Virtue, all virtues as one knowledge differently applied. Practical versus theoretical knowledge, motivating grasp of value versus non-committal Theta Epsilon Omega Rho Alpha, Aristotle. 2 Happy Lives, contemplative Sigma Omicron Phi Alpha, and political Phi Rho Nu Eta Sigma Iota plus ethical virtues. Doctrine of the Mean, ethical virtue as intermediate determined by right reason. Living in Agreement, Stoic End, conformity with cosmic logos/nature. Preferred indifference, value without being genuine goods, Stoicism. Apatheia/metriopatheia, extirpation of passions versus Aristotelian moderation. Catastematic pleasure, stable freedom from pain and disturbance, Epicurus. Epike, suspension of judgment, skepticism. Fourfold observances, guidance by nature, feeling, laws/customs, arts Sextus. True self as intellect, Plotinian identification of the person with noomicron. Three-level virtue, civic/purifying/intellectual, Plotinus. Theurgy, ritual connection to the gods when intellect alone cannot save, Iamblichus. Reading comprehension questions. 1. What is Cooper's distinction between living from and living in accordance with one's philosophy? And why does it matter for modern academia? 2. State the three Socratic assumptions. Which does Cooper think modernity has most clearly abandoned? 3. How does Cooper's critique of had it relocate spiritual exercises in a history of philosophy? 4. How does the notional Socrates resolve the paradox of ignorance alongside confident moral claims? Sigma Omicron Phi Alpha versus Pi Iota Sigma Tau Mu Eta? 5. Why, for Aristotle, is ethical knowledge practical rather than theoretical? And how does that underwrite philosophy as a way of life? 6. Explain Aristotle's two happy lives and their hierarchy. What problem does this pose for later schools? 7. How do Stoic preferred indifference preserve ordinary valuing while keeping virtue as the sole good? 8. Contrast Stoic apatheia with Aristotelian metriopatheia. What is a passion on each view? 9. How can Epicureans and skeptics still offer ways of life if they diminish reason's dogmatic authority? 10. Why, for Cooper, do Iamblichus's theurgy and Augustine's conversion mark the end of philosophy as a pagan way of life?